So, just to get us started, can you provide us a bit of background about yourself?
Sure, yeah. So I'm Rob McMorran. I'm a researcher, a social researcher in RESAS in the Scottish Government, which is part of the government that basically looks after research, evidence, and analysis relating to sort of rural and environmental areas of interest to policy. And I've been there for about a year and a half, going on 2 years now, I think. And prior to that, I was a researcher in Scotland's Rural College, working mainly in the areas of sort of land use behaviours, and rural development.
What is the ideal window of opportunity for engaging with policy professionals? When can researchers be most useful from a policy perspective?
That I that one's a bit trickier. I don't know if there's like an ideal window necessarily, like one point. They call it the policy cycle, and it goes around and around in circles. And people in government will say that we just do the same thing on different areas every 5 years or every certain number of years, or on a parliamentary cycle, or whatever you want to kind of refer to it as. It sort of goes in circles, I suppose. And maybe there are key points in that process, like at the start of the development of a new intervention or the start of a new program, to try to get in on the ground, I suppose, so that you understand what's coming and then shape your research potentially kind of around that, or at least make it relevant to that. But I would say researchers can add value probably at different stages of the policy process and all the way through the policy process. It kind of depends on the type of, it depends on the policy, it depends on the type of research, and the type of project. But increasingly, I'd say probably where feasible, involving policy, like I said previously at the outset, or trying to embed them or build them in, to help get them to shape the objectives of the research, really, because that really is going to increase the relevance, I suppose, and it's going to make sure that they know what's coming and they have had an influence on that. And you'll find that people become more engaged and more interested if they've been involved and they have had some influence on it. And also then probably towards the later stages of your research, so that because they want to see the outcomes. Is there new evidence there? Does it kind of help? Yeah, like I said, it's kind of circular. So it's about involvement throughout, but it's also, like I said, and don't overstate it too much, but it's about kind of being aware of your network and building those relationships. So yes, there's a window, but it's as much about building relationships and embedding people into processes as much as it is about any sort of ideal window, I suppose. And I just wanted to flag one or two things because, and it relates to this point I was making about functionality and I suppose responsiveness as well. And that this really depends on researchers. If researchers don't want to be policy relevant, if they don't particularly want to impact policy, that's fine. It's your own. But if that's your focus and you do want to do that, one of the things that can help is to be responsive. And some of the people I worked with over the last few years were very good at that, I found. And I hadn't really experienced all of that before. And what I mean by that is, for example, I'll give you two examples. One was Brexit. And some researchers were really responsive when Brexit was on the cards and began to do work very quickly to look at, in their area, it's like rural development or agriculture or whatever, what was the impact of Brexit going to be? And so, for example, in Scotland's Rural College, they did work on that, which was immediately picked up on by the Scottish government because they were really thirsty at the time for evidence related to that looming challenge, if you like, and so that had an impact then as a result, and it was recognised by government as being responsive, as being very useful, and so it was valued, let's say. And the other area was the pandemic. And similarly, and I think there's probably other universities probably had more of an impact. SUC is kind of agricultural, and so there's a lot of work done on Brexit and agriculture impacts. There was some stuff done as well at the time, and in the James Hutton Institute as well, but also in some of the universities on the pandemic and what was happening in rural areas, for example, in relation to the pandemic. What were the longer term impacts of the pandemic going to be? So again, it's that being responsive. And of course, you'd have seen at the time, some universities were doing impacts on actually modeling the impacts of the pandemic, which were gigantic. It's a hugely impactful area of research and evidence gathering at the time. So I just wanted to mention both of those because it relates to that point about functionality, about usefulness, about relevance. because there's a direct relationship between how relevant and functional your research is from a policy perspective and the policy impact of your research, of course, so it's about being kind of flexible, being adaptive, saying, oh, actually, yes, we could do some work in that area. How can we get some funding? Can we maybe offer ourselves? Can we put a project together or something? So kind of changing tack as the winds change, because things are very changeable these days, and it's not a stable world. So I suppose, like, within your domain, within your area, I'm not suggesting a researcher should change, topics wholesale, but within your area, is there a slight shift of emphasis, which would allow you to increase the relevance of your work, given that something has changed dramatically? You might be doing a 3-year project, but in the middle of that 3-year project, something huge has happened in the world. Can you steer your project a little bit so that it becomes more relevant, if that sort of makes sense?
Yeah, and I guess that speaks to the timing issue as well, in terms of what is currently on the agenda, at government level and so on.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, things change quickly, and policy moves. Sometimes I think policy moves really slowly, but actually, it moves reasonably quickly from a research perspective. So if you've got this 3-year research project that you put in motion, by the end of the 3 years, the policy emphasis could have really changed, and yet you haven't caught up with it. So you've done this research, which 3 years ago looked super relevant, maybe 4 years ago, because you probably wrote it a year before you got the funding. So, it's about how do I maintain a bit of flexibility in this project, still clearly define what the objectives and the approach is, but then allow me to tweak it sufficiently so that it's of relevance in a whatever the world is in 3 years' time.